would, grab your Bibles.
We're going to go to Matthew 8 this morning. Matthew 8, verses 23 through 27. In the Pew Bibles, page 813. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and sea obey him?" Let's pray. Father, as we open up your word this morning, we pray that you would open up our hearts. You are a God who identifies with his people. You don't stand off in the distance and leave us to ourselves. You love your people, and you have food and a word for them. So I pray that you would deliver that word this morning through me and protect it from all other error. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Many of us, including myself, live in fear. Some of us with great fear. Fear of failure, fear of being found out to be a hypocrite, fear of losing our position in the church if someone better were to come around, fear of change in our life, in our church, which we're going through now, fear that our faith is a fraud. We fear loneliness. Just look at how much time we spend on Facebook. Give you an indication. We fear even more so the suffering and pain that we go through when death comes. This morning's passage, I believe, is special because here Matthew recounts a moment in the lives of God's people, his disciples, in intense fear. These disciples are screaming in terror at the sight of these massive waves that come and they start swallowing up the boat. The pain then is also compounded in some sense because it doesn't even seem that Jesus notices that it's going on. He's sleeping. And then it climaxes and is cut off at the end with this question by the disciples at verse 27. What sort of man is this? So Matthew, skillfully pointing his original readers to the Old Testament texts about Yahweh, shows us that Jesus is no mere man. Jesus is Yahweh himself, dwelling among mankind with authority over all their circumstances. This passage isn't just good news, however, for Matthew's original readers. It's good news for you. It's good news for me. The path to true discipleship requires sometimes massive and seismic storms, which tend to instill fear in our hearts. And yet Jesus, who is Yahweh in human flesh, leads us into them and is still in control over them all, and compassionately stands in the boat with us to develop our faith in God. So this morning, this passage, what I believe is happening is there is a relationship between discipleship and what we call Christology, the study of who Christ is, and those are interwoven together in here. So let's look at it together. Let's read the passage. Verse 23, excuse me. And when he came to the other side, and when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. So when Jesus gets into the boat, notice the word followed. Matthew uses this word 25 times in his gospel. And so it becomes an extremely important word for us. What I want you to notice about this following is who initiates the trip. It's not the disciples. Jesus initiates the trip. Jesus is the one that's about to take them onto a boat, which is about to go through a seismic storm. And they follow him. Very simply, what I get from this is that God will often initiate your journey as a disciple of his into tough waters. You understand that, right? Sometimes we get ourselves into those tough situations. Our sin does, right? We disobey, we get into those tough waters, sometimes of ourselves. Sometimes the waters are actually, the trip to the waters are initiated by him, by God himself. And you see this in the person of Jesus. I also saw this when I started thinking about Jesus being led into the wilderness. Who leads Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days and 40 nights? Holy Spirit. God leads Jesus into tough times. He's doing that with us. And this storm indicates that their discipleship is about to be tested. Now, what I get from that further then is this. We have an American concept that following God means things are going to be great. My business is going to go well. My relationships are going to be straight. It's going to be great. Right? We do. We do. And when we go through a tough time, we start to question whether we made a mistake or not. But we also need to be aware of the fact that although we do that sometimes and we get ourselves into trouble, you have to remember that even God himself will take you into perilous waters. So not every tough time that you're going through in your life is necessarily because you did something wrong. So that's the path of following Jesus. And it's not always pretty. But not only does he take us on this path, I want you to see that there's an actual pain of following Jesus. And that's seen in verses 24 through 25. Let's read it again. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." The pain. The intensity of the storm gives us a lot to think about here, I think. This Sea of Galilee is kind of an odd place because of like the sort of wind tunnel mountains and around the sea. So these storms would just come up out of nowhere sometimes, and it's a normal occurrence. One commentator says that, some people have even gone to the point of experimenting themselves, saying, I don't really believe this happens. Like, it just happens, the storm just shows up. And so they go out and camp out on the shores sometimes of the Sea of Galilee, and they experience it themselves sometimes. Just like, oh, these things really come out of nowhere, literally. And so Matthew uses this word that we get the word seismic from, which is normally corresponds to like an earthquake. Not necessarily that this is an earthquake, but the devastation that this can cause would be almost similar to an earthquake. This is a massive storm and scary. And others have pointed out, like these disciples, a lot of them were fishermen. So they've seen some storms before. This scared them to death. So they come up unexpectedly, these massive storms. Sometimes where God leads you and this church will cause trouble. They will. Sometimes we go through those kinds of troubles to the point where that we actually question whether God cares. I know you have. I have. Look at Psalm 44 with me. Psalm 44, verse 23 through 24. Awake, why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not, listen to the wording, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? So even in the Old Testament, you see the very same thing. You go through these troubles and you start to question whether God really even cares or not. These pains, these oppressions, these tough things that we go through. Does it seem to you then that God is asleep in your pain? Just think of those circumstances where you doubt. That should prompt us to the third thing then, which is the point or the purpose of following Jesus here. Let's look at verses 26 and 27. And he said to them, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Often this passage gets preached in such a way to say this: God will calm the storms of your life. I've heard it preached that way. And what happens is, as you study this passage more, that's not the point of this passage. Because how do you explain then that people are dying in the world because of their faith? Is that the calming of the storm? Getting martyred? I mean, I guess so. But not even those, some of those get martyred. Sometimes they just get mangled and hurt and bodies destroyed, but they still live. The point of this passage, I think, has two things to tell us. The first is this: the identity of who Jesus is. When you were in Matthew's audience, I believe, and you had known your Old Testament well enough, which most of us don't, and I raise my hand there, we see that the things Jesus is doing in this passage point to something bigger. They point to something that only God does. Mere men don't calm storms. So you see it in a couple of ways. The disciples themselves say, Lord, save us. Why are they calling him Lord? And why are they asking him to save them? He's just a man. What is he going to do? They're in a terrifying storm. It's amazing. But when you know the phrase, Lord, save, that's used in the Old Testament 11 times, and 10 of them refer to who? Yahweh, God. Lord, save us. Matthew is pointing us in a certain direction. He wants you to start to understand, who is this man? Go to Psalm 89 with me. Psalm 89, verses 8 and 9. O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you. You rule the raging sea. when its waves rise, you still them. Who is this man? When you knew your Old Testament, you knew the answer to the question that Matthew was trying to present to us. This is not a mere man. Only God does these things. And Matthew does this so many times when they start dealing with the whole, who can forgive sins but God? And Jesus forgives sins? That should have been an indication of something, right? This is Yahweh. And what Matthew is trying to tell us here is this. God is sovereign, in complete control over not only creation, which he proves, but circumstance. I have come to find in my own life that it's very easy to make my circumstances the robber of my own joy all the time. And then I come to this realization when I get to this passage that he's the one in control of those circumstances. So no matter what trial's given us, either deliberately from God himself or sometimes allowed, he has authority over them, and that should be enough. One of the other things that we learn from this passage in the background is this, that when somebody had control, even mythologically or whatever, control over the seas was like a symbol of power over evil. The seas were a symbol of evil, and to have power over them was to be in control of them. So if one commentator says, look, if you press this far enough, he's also trying to point out something else, which is the circumstances which Satan himself is allowed to have control over in your life still does not negate God's authority. God is still the one in control of them, and he overcomes that evil if he does so desires to. That's powerful for me. So even if Satan is allowed to harm you or push the trial in your life to its extreme, God is in control and has allowed it. So the first thing that you saw was there's this identity that Matthew wants to see. Jesus is no mere man. He's God in the flesh. It is a massively essential thing that we have to believe as Christians. And I'm going to hound that every time it comes up in a passage because we want to believe it. We have to. The second thing is man's unbelief is revealed. So the purpose of this passage is that Jesus is God. And the second thing is that God is also revealing our unbelief. So the disciples say, Lord, save us, we are perishing. And he said to them, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? I used to think that was really just like this, well, it was just our faith is small. I just need to grow my faith a little bit. But he's rebuking them in the sense of saying, look, you have no faith in God. Now, the reason why I think I can go there is because of the contrast between that and what Jesus is doing in the boat before they wake him up. He's sleeping in the boat. How do you sleep through a storm? I don't care how tired you are. How do you sleep through that? And I think there's this contrast being made. Our faithlessness in God and his complete faithfulness and trust in God. He trusts God to the point of actually sleeping through a seismic storm. And that's why I think I can take it that far. J.C. Ryle says this, what a vivid and instructive picture we have here of the hearts of thousands of believers. How many have faith and love enough to forsake all for Christ's sake and to follow him wherever he goes, and yet are full of fears in the hour of trial? How many have grace enough to turn to Jesus in every trouble, crying, Lord, save us, and yet not grace enough to lie still and believe in the darkest hour that all is well? Oh, we just got wrangled up in that one together, didn't we? So this life of discipleship that I'm reading from this passage is sort of like this oak tree. your faith experience grows upward like a tree, strong against these winds that come against it. But that's only because the roots of our faith have grown deeper and anchored deeper. And so I think that's what Jesus is challenging us with here. You are faithless, I am faithful. But there's hope. He's trying to teach them, right? He's trying to teach them. Your roots will need to grow deep too. And so these seismic storms that we're going through are not simply because God, He doesn't care about me. What if the seismic storms of whatever circumstance you're going through right now is actually for the purpose of growing your faith in God, not for simply because you think you're being punished or, what if? So for instance, what of those of us that have this fear of staying with a spouse because they don't meet our needs? What if God is teaching you something and me something through even the tough points of our marriage where my needs aren't being met? Have you ever seen it that way? I think divorce would look kind of less prevalent in the church if we at least looked at it that way. God, who is sovereign over the circumstances, allowed this marriage or even brought it together. And who am I to question? I'm not talking about physical abuse and things like that. That's another discussion. But I'm talking about the everyday. My needs aren't met, therefore I'm going to justify a divorce. But what if He's trying to teach you something instead about you and not so much your spouse? I mentioned it earlier, but we sometimes have a fear of giving up a position in the church. This is my ministry. It belongs to me. It's not necessarily mine, is it? We're stewards of these ministries, right? And we need not fear if someone brings a younger person along that might be skilled in it and you get to mentor that person and help them grow. Instead of looking at it as a fearful thing, look at it as let's keep this church alive and mentor and disciple others. One that we need to really keep open to is a fear of cutting church programs. I'm very serious about this too. I think we need to just really think and pray these things through. We have a fear that if we cut this, it's like the end of the world. And what's amazing to me about church programs is they're like government programs. Once you start it, it never ends. No matter what's going on around us, no matter who we have to fill a position or not, we just can't let it go. But what if letting it go is one of the most healthy things that we can do for the church? With a changing community around us, with different needs of the community being met in different ways. I think your faith can grow in that way as a church if we take that seriously. Not be afraid to lose what's not eternal anyway. The last thing I want us to see is the promise of following Jesus. Verse 26. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. He does demonstrate that he can calm the storms. But I don't think that's the point. I think we're missing something. The point is bigger, I think, and the point is this. The storms that you're going through, not only have they been initiated by him, but he's in it with you. I mean, how many of these stories do we need to see where Jesus is in it with them? How many stories do we need to see in the book of Acts where they're persecuted and harmed and killed, and Jesus is with them through it, though? Matthew 28:20 comes to mind when I think about this. Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. So I think even in this passage, we see a theme where God promises to be with you through it, even the ones where especially where he's initiated them. He's going to be with you through it. Not simply calm them, because not all our storms get calmed. Sometimes we go through things for years. How many times I can think about my grandma being taken to court for years? Well, he didn't calm that storm right away. He was in it with her. And so when you share your faith, it's the same thing, I believe. He's in it with you. Why does this text matter? The first thing I want to draw out from this whole passage at this point is this. The real terror, friends, is not the storm. The real terror is not the storm. The real terror should be our fear of the one who has authority over the storm. The storm is scary, no doubt about it. But that pales in comparison to the one who can stop it at a moment like that. Imagine coming into the presence of God and to be judged for your rebellion against him, your faithlessness. That's more terrifying than any storm. And we will scream in horror. But praise God that God himself loves his people in such a way that he identifies with us. He became human, like you. He agonized at the fact that he knew he was going to the cross in Gethsemane, according to God the Father's plan. He was abused by his own people and by Gentiles alike. God himself has taken on the ultimate storm, which is his wrath, which is on your shoulders. On some of our shoulders. I don't know whose shoulders. God has taken on the ultimate storm of pain for sin on the cross. Your rebellion, my rebellion against God. That, I think, is what makes this passage amazing. He has identified with us, and he has suffered with us, so that our suffering pales in comparison to his suffering for you. That should change the way we live, I believe. All of us. So Matthew wants his readers to come to this conclusion that Jesus is God and identifies with his people. As his disciples who follow him, we experience storms, and sometimes they instill great fear. And there are things that we don't have control over. But we have to remember sometimes those paths are initiated by God himself, and he leads us into them. But our comfort is in the one who had the power to subdue them, and the one who submitted to the Father's will by going through the ultimate storm, the cross. So he trusted the Father so passionately that he was able to even sleep through it. He trusted in the Father's care to execute the plan of paying for mankind's sin and reconciling us with him to God. He identifies with our pain, our suffering, our fear. So what about you this morning? What are you afraid of? What are you holding on to? What sense do you not believe that his authority is enough? And that by trusting him, he will walk you through it, not necessarily take it away. Let's pray. Father, I pray for this word this morning that it would go forth. That those of us who have walked without you become aware of the intense, terrifying nature of being in front of you without your Son. that we would trust in his cross to pay for our sin and to free us from future sin, that by future grace we would trust your promises. You will be with us always. For those of us who already trust in that cross, I pray that we would trust that cross further in the fact that the way we live matters as a believer. The way we treat each other matters. The way we go to work matters. This is not an isolated faith where we just come together, talk about you, and forget about you for 6 days of the week. You loved us enough to become one of us. I pray that we would trust you, that you were in the boat with us, whatever that fear is that we have. I pray that you would strengthen this church. In Jesus' name, amen.